Welcome. My name is Rachel VanSickle-Ward. I'm a professor of political studies at Pitzer College, and I'm also an alum of Pitzer, class of '99. And I'm really excited to be here today to have a conversation with Dana about some of the research we've both been involved in, and also just to think a little bit about current events and women in politics and how it all fits together. So, Dana?
Thanks. I'm Dana Nothnagel. I'm a senior here at Pitzer. I'll be graduating in May, and I'm a political studies major, and I have been Professor VanSickle-Ward's research assistant for about a year and a half. So Professor, you're nearing a completion of your book, Politics of the Pill. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about it and some of the key findings from it?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things we did in thinking about this talk that we're having today is title it, If You're Not at the Table, You're on the Menu. And I got that from a phrase that Cecile Research has used to talk about the centrality of having women involved in political discussions. And that really frames a lot of what we try to do with this book, which is to say, what happens when women are not at the table, be that reporting on birth control politics or on the dais at a Supreme Court hearing or at a Senate debate. What happens when they're not there, and what happens when they are there, and what are the differences in policies that emerge? And so what we try and do with this book is have like a 360 perspective on the different stages in the policymaking process. So agenda setting, deliberation in legislative bodies, hearings before the Supreme Court, and also the media coverage that happens of that policy once it emerges to kind of track the different effects of having women at every stage. And to me, one of the most important takeaways is the first, it does matter. It matters a lot. You see the different implications of women being present in those conversations, but also that women are able to make their voices heard even when they're not formally at the table. So an example of this is when there was a hearing to debate Obamacare's application of preventative care to include birth control. Initially, no women were invited to that hearing, and women found a way, both the senators that were sitting in the hearing themselves, but not as any of the people testifying, to raise a ruckus about it, to say this is not acceptable. And then women in interest groups and sort of women activists took on that charge as well. And so it's both about formally being at the table and also what happens when you find other ways to kind of get your voice heard.
Yeah, I remember in class looking at some of those panels. They were all men, all white men. Yeah. What motivated you to write the book?
Well, it really links to the point you just made, which is I've been interested in public policy for a long time. That's what my training is in within political science. Interested in gender and politics for a long time. So on one level, this was a really natural intersection of those two things. But specifically that all-male panel, I remember very clearly seeing that, on the television screens, in the news coverage, and it bringing back a very formative moment for me in watching political events, which was the Anita Hill hearing, which I know we've talked about in class before as well. But essentially, when Clarence Thomas was nominated to the Supreme Court, Anita Hill came forward at some point with accusations of sexual harassment, and then she also testified during those hearings. And when she testified, you had a black woman testifying about her experience, and then an entirely white male panel of senators that then constituted the Judiciary Committee evaluating. And it was brutal. And I knew it was brutal at the time, even though I was only a child, and having sort of grown up thinking a little bit more in depth about the dynamics there, I really developed a keener sense of just why it was so troubling to watch that unfold. And so thinking back to that memory and then watching it happen again, although slightly in the reverse because now it was those testifying, not the senators, I really felt a sense of sort of continuity there, but also, well, will there be a difference that comes from it? So, for example, after the Anita Hill hearing, or the Clarence Thomas hearing where she testified, the election after 1992 was designated the Year of the Woman because a lot more women than had been in the past were elected to Congress that year. And some people have argued that there was a connection between the two, that in watching that all-male panel, there was some sort of outrage that developed that kind of galvanized. There's a lot of other dimensions that happened in that election, but I think when you look at the consequences of leaving women out, something potentially positive can come from people watching that and saying, actually, that's not acceptable. We need to bring more women into the conversation.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And we'll see what kind of parallels are drawn from the testimony that's going to happen on Monday.
Yeah, it's very timely.
So what are some key things that you hope your readers take away from the book?
A couple things. One, I want them to take seriously the idea that policymaking doesn't happen in a vacuum. I think sometimes we have this unfortunate habit of divorcing policy and politics. So, the policy, we can just kind of do a cost-benefit analysis, and we'll have kind of wise minds get together and craft the best and most appropriate way forward. And then in a wholly separate realm, there is sort of the political fray. On one level, it should be obvious that that's not the case, but I think academically we sometimes divorce those things. So one thing I really wanted to do, and actually I try to do with all my work, is to say that policymaking is inherently a political process. Every word that is chosen in a statute, every word that is chosen in a judicial opinion from a Supreme Court case has politics infused in it in a variety of ways. That's kind of the most basic thing I wanted readers to take away. And then the second thing I think is so important links back to my earlier point about if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So thinking about the consequences of lack of women's political participation.
And what's your next project?
I'm so glad you asked. So my next project is entitled The Hillary Effect. It is co-authored with Ivy Cargyle and Jen Marola and Denise Davids. And I should note that my earlier book, The Politics of the Pill, is co-authored with Kevin Wellston. I love collaborative work. So this project is an edited volume where we solicited a number of scholars and activists and candidates to reflect on Hillary's legacy, essentially. Sort of what did her campaign, her candidacy, her career writ large mean to you? And we cast that question really open on purpose. And so we've gotten a lot of really fascinating submissions that are about, well, I'm a rabbi, and here's how working in a really male-dominated field was influenced by seeing a woman run for office. Or I'm now running for office because I was inspired by her attempt to break the glass ceiling. Or I am working in this policy space, and thinking about her work in that policy space has changed the way I think about it. So it really kind of runs the gamut. It's not all sort of maybe the way we think about politics traditionally, but even more broadly as part of politics and culture, what did her candidacy mean, and what will it continue to mean as you see kind of those ripple effects come to fruition.
Wow, I can't wait to read it.
I hope you will.
Well, that's really exciting.
Can I ask you a little bit more about the work that you've been doing?
Yeah, definitely.
So the first thing I wanted to say is, the Politics of the Pill would not have happened without your research assistants. And one thing I hope alumni watching are aware of is that Pitzer students are really involved in the research agenda of a lot of faculty members. It's something pretty critical to the work that we do. And so one thing I wanted to ask you, if you don't tell me, you don't have to tell me the stuff you hated about it, but is if you have lessons that you took from it, or ideas that you took from it, or what your experience has been working as a research assistant on this project.
Yeah, so working as your research assistant has been one of the highlights of my time here at Pitzer, because I just kind of went into it. I loved your classes, so I was like, this is definitely going to be a fun time, but I didn't know the extent to which I'd be engaged in it, and I joke about this often. I've never had so much fun entering data into an Excel spreadsheet.
You have to be careful saying that, because I'll be like, oh, Dana wants to do some more data entry. Note to self.
And it was exciting for me because it was like a key moment in my academic career when I realized that these political questions that might not seem so relevant are actually incredibly relevant and relevant to my life as well. So when I was doing research for you, I felt like I was really making a difference. And I realized that this is something that I could do with my career. And it's inspired me to hopefully have a career in research when I graduate in May. And
I don't want to talk about that, Dana. It makes me very sad.
And yeah, just about the power that asking political questions can have in informing legislation.
Yeah, I think one thing that I find so heartening about that is Not just that you got excited about data entry, although that does warm my heart because careful data entry is foundational to any well-executed project. But just the way you said the power of asking political questions is really big, right? Because I think it's really easy to get sucked into a kind of hot take conversation about current events. And I think there's a lot that students and professors have to offer those conversations, but some of it really involves taking a little bit of a step back and the power of asking questions that require in-depth, nuanced answers to really fully unpack. So I think that sort of says a lot about not just what you learned nuts and bolts along the way, but also kind of what you're going to do and what traction you're going to get from that experience. And I also have really noticed in having you as a research assistant that one thing that you really balance so well, and that I hope that any student can think about, is there's the sort of detail-oriented nature of carrying out something that requires a lot of, like you said, data entry and careful analysis, but also the big picture questions. And one thing that I always tell people when talking about your work is we would have this sort of nitty-gritty conversation. Okay, let's make sure all this is accurate and we're coding this correctly and make sure everything is 100% T's crossed and I's dotted. And then you would say, so I want to ask you this question that was completely, a mile back, and what are the implications of this? Or have you thought about this dimension? Or what is this going to mean for this other policy area? And that's really big, right? Because sometimes you get so lost in the nitty-gritty that you forget that piece of it. So that was really exciting to watch. The other question I had for you, and we've talked about this a decent amount, is you have a particular presence in the classroom that I find very inspiring, and it's very confident. But I'm cognizant that not every student is able to have that presence, especially not in the beginning. So when you're thinking about students coming in now, what thoughts do you have about, navigating a space, maybe particularly as a young woman, that is not always as welcoming as it could be, or that maybe your expertise doesn't feel quite up to par? How do you sort of think about them taking those steps and being more confident in the classroom?
Yeah, I have two things that really come to mind with that. First, I think that sometimes the classroom can reflect the political situation that we're talking about, and learning about certain topics can empower certain people. And we've been talking a lot about women being disempowered in some ways, and I think sometimes that can make women in the classroom feel less confident about talking and speaking up. But I also think that there's a lot of, like now after Trump was elected, a lot of women coming to power more, and I hope that kind of reflects itself in the political situation on campus, and that students also female students feel more comfortable talking about these sorts of topics. And on top of that, I think that some advice that I would give to a student coming to Pitzer interested in studying political studies is to think broadly about political influence. I think a lot of times before we come to college, we think about politics as in terms of campaigns and writing legislation. And that was the big moment I had with you, that, research and policy can have a lot of influence. So I think that if students can find other areas in politics to feel like they can become experts on and feel empowered in, that hopefully that will help, especially women and other people from marginalized backgrounds, find their ways into all the different little veins and valleys of politics.
That's awesome. And just bridging on that, is there any other things that you think about in terms of your decision to be a political studies major and kind of how you see that informing your choices moving forward? Yeah,
when I came to, starting back a long time ago,
way back when.
For most of my life that I was aware of what was happening in our country, Barack Obama was our president. And I kind of came to Pitzer expecting Hillary to win, and I thought we were going to kind of exist in that same framework. And I was really excited. I wanted to run for office. I wanted to register people to vote. And then when President Trump was elected, it was kind of, I think everyone took a step back. And for me, it was like a moment where I was feeling really jaded, and I was like, what my previous goals were don't really apply anymore. But I think it's been really interesting because I've noticed that what we're navigating right now with the Trump presidency, I'm kind of doing it alongside of my professors. And I think that's been a really key part of my experience at Pitzer.
Yeah, I think that's pretty central to the Pitzer experience in general, is that we're doing it alongside each other and that we're really navigating this space together. So for sure, for me, when I was teaching campaigns and elections, when the election happened, and I very clearly remember going into class the Thursday after and feeling that sort of we're all in this together, and that I had as much to learn from the students, and they sort of kept me buoyed in a way, as I did to sort of offer them wisdom. So I think that mentality is a pretty Pitzer-esque one in a lot of ways. I also wanted to ask, and I really want to circle back to some of the points you made about the Trump presidency, but before we get there, thinking about the idea of bringing this together, you have done, I think, I would say a very classic Pitzer thing, but also a specifically awesome Dana thing, which is that you created your own syllabus. And this was all, I should tell viewers, this is all Dana. No one prompted her to do this. This was her decision, that she needed to write a syllabus for her family that they could do together to think about gender and politics. And I really want to hear about what that experience was like, both in designing the syllabus and also in learning with your family, what that was like.
Yeah, so coming from the Midwest, and most of the other students here are from California, and a lot of their families have kind of talked about topics that we discuss here at Pitzer. And my parents have always been super supportive of me coming to Pitzer and my academic goals, but I kind of noticed that kind of a year or two into my experience at Pitzer, we weren't on the same page with a lot of topics that I was learning about in class, and they had never heard before. And it was frustrating to me because I felt like this was something I want to dedicate my life to, and my parents didn't, they weren't on the same page with everything. So I decided to make a summer course. It was a 7-week course with readings every week, and my parents got on board with it and mostly participated and did the readings.
Mostly? Did you have to flunk them on anything?
It was ungraded, but
internally,
next time, yeah. And it covered kind of topics that, a lot of students coming to Pitzer would spend their first few months learning about basic systems of oppression, and topics ranging everywhere from feminism to the gender spectrum. It was very broad, and we had a lot of difficult conversations. It was actually harder than I thought it would be. Yeah. We disagreed on a lot of points, and it got into a lot of details about our family and my upbringing, my sister's upbringing. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the summer, they were, I think it was a net positive outcome for all of us. And we all felt a little bit more aware. I felt like we were just on the same page more. And I even hear my parents now saying words that we learned in class, like intersectionality. And so I feel like we're all moving forward together. And for me, it was kind of a lesson in accessibility. Mm-hmm. And I forget sometimes that being here in the Claremont bubble a little bit, that what I'm studying in politics especially isn't relevant to everyone else, mm-hmm. that I'm just on a completely different page. So it was kind of a moment where I checked myself and thought about making some of the ideas that I think about more accessible for others.
That's really big. And have you thought at all about other syllabi that you might design for future summers?
I'm not sure. I'm interested in maybe doing something around settler colonialism, but that'll be something I start to plan in next semester.
Okay. You are graduating this year. We'll give you a little time to finish your thesis, and then. So I wanted to circle back to some points that you made when we were talking about our role as sort of political scientists in this current era, and I'd love it if you could say a little bit about, because you talked, I think, really passionately about your life on campus and interacting with students, and also your life interacting with your family, but with a broader community, when someone asks you, what's happening with Trump, or what do you have to offer for this current moment, is there anything that really comes to mind?
I'm lost, like a lot of people, and I think like one of the things that I think the most is that my predictions have been really off in the past, so I'm not interested in speculating anymore. But I find that conversations that are most empowering to me are less about maybe Trump and current events, but other policy that's happening kind of under the surface. Mm-hmm. And especially at the state level, I'm taking a really interesting class about California law and politics right now, surrounding environmental policy. And I found that that's a place where I'm able to engage with a little bit more structure than I am with national politics. But what about you? I mean, as a political studies professor?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question. I think I honestly love that you say that you're lost and your predictions have been wrong, because I think the entire discipline felt that way in a lot of ways. I should note that the predictions weren't as off as people sometimes think they were. So, for example, the national polls were pretty close. She got more or less what she was expected to in terms of the national vote. So it was more of an issue of sort of a handful of states being off in terms of the polling lining up with the outcome. That said, I think there really has been this serious reckoning about what political science scholarship has to offer in this moment, particularly because I think the current administration is often, in addition to a lot of other horrible things, really devalues the role of research, right? Or the role of sort of careful, thoughtful policy deliberation. That's not something that's really being valued in the current era, it seems. And so one thing I think is important is what you said earlier, which is we can still be doing that work. We can still be grounded in that work of careful policy analysis. And the other thing I think kind of ties back into conversations we've had a lot, which is what does it look like for women in politics in the current era? And I know this is a question, we asked for some questions ahead of time that were interesting to potential viewers about what does the current moment look like for women in politics. So I think I'll just spend a moment kind of reflecting on a couple of those, and then I'd love to hear your reflections on that as well. The first thing I want to say is I often get the question, well, now we have more women running for office, which is true, and does that mean that we will see women support those women candidates? And that question makes a ton of sense, particularly given all the attention to things like Me Too and all the attention to women kind of breaking through some barriers of late. The thing to keep in mind, though, is partisanship is such a strong predictor of vote choice that it's really hard for sort of a shared gender identity to overcome that. And one way I put it to sort of liberal or progressive individuals is, well, Sarah Palin was a woman. Is that someone that you felt compelled to switch your vote for because she was a woman? And the answer is, of course, no, for the vast majority of Democratic voters. All of that said, so what that means is the likelihood of women turning out en masse to switch parties to support a woman running for office is non-existent. But there are a number of very close races this time, and so I think there's always a likelihood that at a very close race, someone feeling compelled by seeing a woman candidate could make a difference. And more broadly, I would say that there is, I think, a sea change happening in terms of how women in power are perceived right now. And that's a huge part of what motivated me to work on the Hillary effect. Was I think that is very much linked to her candidacy. I think one thing that I took away from her candidacy is, you can evaluate a particular individual, Hillary Clinton or Sarah Palin or whoever else, and say, okay, they're doing this right and this wrong, and therefore here's the takeaway for women in politics. But that's really tricky because it's just one person, right? And so it can be hard to generalize, it can be hard to draw broader conclusions. And I think one thing I've seen taking into consideration both Clinton's campaign and some of the energy you've seen among women choosing to run for office now is, let's try and broaden the conversation away from just one particular candidate, which is still important, and we need to support those candidates if we believe in them. But to think more broadly about sort of the systems that allow those women to have a fair shot or not, right? So then the conversation becomes not just how good a job did Clinton do, but how good a job did she do in the context of what she was up against, right? Or how good a job did she do given that there's never been a woman nominated for a major party before? Or how good a job did she do given that she had already broken all these barriers up until that point, which left some scar tissue, right? And leading off from that, I think when I often get questions about, well, what should women do to improve their chances, or what should women do to be better candidates? And I kind of asked you a similar question around what can women do in the classroom. And what I've been thinking a lot about lately is, if we're going to ask that question, we need to make sure we're asking the question of all of us to say, what are we doing to change the culture to give those women any kind of a shot? Because they're always going to have their package of obstacles or failures, but if we're helping to kind of create at least a more level playing field, then maybe they'll have a better chance to be whatever kind of candidate they could ultimately be. I saw Michelle Obama speak not that long ago, and someone shouted from the audience, like, why don't you run? And she actually got kind of visibly upset for a minute, and she was like, stop doing that. Like, I'm putting words in your mouth a little bit, but don't keep asking me to be your savior. She even said this specifically, I'm no different than Hillary. If we can't change the conversation about women candidates or what kind of change we want more broadly, then any individual candidate can't do that on her own. So that's kind of where I'm at right now in kind of what the takeaway is from the work that we've been doing or what we know to help kind of move the conversation forward, even at a time when there's a lot of understandable frustration about the limits that are placed on women candidates and women more generally.
Wow, that's really interesting. Do you have any hopes for the next election?
Yeah, I mean, I think it has been exciting to see a lot of women come forward to run. I've been excited to see that there's been really cool changes in the kinds of campaigns that they've been able to run. So just one example of that is there's been like a handful of advertisements where women are breastfeeding on camera. I've never seen that before. And like more than one, like all of a sudden this little flurry of like nonchalantly nursing on camera as a candidate. There also, I think, been women talking about their kind of political strength in all sorts of different ways, whether that's drawing strength from being a mother, or there have been a couple candidates that have talked about sort of their athletic accomplishments. And again, not that all women have to be athletes or all women have to be mothers, but if there's more than one, if you see a variation in sort of human experience among these women candidates, then I think you start to see that kind of the needle moving a little bit. And the second thing I've been hopeful about is the number of women of color who have been successful in winning primaries of late on the Democratic side, which is important for all sorts of reasons, but in particular, I'm hopeful we'll just reach a broader community of constituents who maybe haven't felt like their voices have been heard before, right? So again, it comes back to if you're not on the table, you're on the menu, and part of that is gender and part of that is race, and obviously the ways that those intersect.
Yeah, I think what you were saying about the kind of diversity of women is really, in a lot of ways, is really interesting. I just had a friend comment to me that she had never seen a candidate bring a child on stage before, like a woman candidate bring a child on stage before, and that kind of struck me. And I think it's great for women my age, especially who might just be thinking about starting their political career, and seeing all these young women especially getting into office and kind of upsetting, especially Democrats, upsetting democratic norms. So yeah, I'm excited for that too.
So what do you think, we have all this reason to be excited, and we have all this reason to be still obviously quite frustrated and disillusioned with elements of our politics right now. When you're thinking about both of those realities, are there particular actions that you find you can take to stay more on the constructive side or to feel more hopeful?
Yeah, I'm a big proponent of voting.
Yes, voting is a good one. Please vote.
There's a report came about Pitzer College showing that only, I believe, 53% of students voted in the last election, which was a little bit disheartening to me. But that's something where I feel like I still feel empowered.
Yeah.
But other ways, I've just been keeping up with the news and immersing myself in my studies as much as I can. That seems like one of the most powerful forms of resistance.
Yeah, I think that's right. And again, circling back to your point about thinking about the power of asking political questions, part of it is just continuing to steep yourself in the work that you're doing that have long-term benefits, right? And I'm really glad you mentioned voting as well, because this is something I've been thinking about a lot. The vote turnout in the 2016 presidential election wasn't abysmal by historical standards, actually. Hillary Clinton got more popular votes than any other president except for Barack Obama. But you still see these huge swaths of eligible voters not turning out to vote. And you see some really concerted efforts to turn away people who should be eligible to vote, right? So stripping rolls or requiring really onerous ID requirements. And so I think as we think about the potential for November, part of that conversation is what kind of candidates do we want to see in office and who do we want to support? And another really big part is voter turnout. And I'm really glad you mentioned the Pitzer student body, because this is something I think I've wrestled with as a student, as a professor. Sometimes, Pitzer students are the most engaged and participatory students of really any group I've ever worked with. And yet, sometimes I think there's a failure to connect engagement in your community with the actual practice of voting. And at times, even a cynicism or a disillusionment with, well, politics is sort of the yucky, dirty, corrupt stuff, and I want to keep myself in a space that is more pure. And to be honest, I think that is limited. I just think that given how engaged Pitzer students are, connecting that engagement to voter turnout makes the goals you have for your community, for social justice, so much more real, right? And so I think one thing I've been excited about since 2016 is I think there has been a real energy around those connections. And I've also heard activists make that point. So Dolores Huerta, who has agreed to be a part of our volume, which I'm really excited about, she makes this point in interviews all the time. Like, if you care about the issues that I'm talking about, if you care about labor rights and equality, then you have to show up at the polling place. Like, it's so essential.
Yeah. Well, yeah. But at least 53% is better than the national average.
Yes,
for you,
I should have made that clear. And I will say the other thing that I think is so inspiring about Pitzer students is when they talk about the work that they're doing for voter turnout. And I should note that I participated with Pitzer students canvassing during the 2016 election, and they were incredibly inspiring. And so there are so many students who really sense the urgency and always have. And one thing that I think is remarkable about the way they talk about it is that when they are knocking on doors or canvassing for candidates, it's very rooted for Pitzer students in the kinds of causes that they want to make a difference in. So it's not just this is a box I should check off to look sort of fancy on a resume. It's really rooted in and grounded in the kind of changes that they want to see. So that's something that I celebrate and want to see even more of it. And I think that political studies students in particular can play a role in kind of bridging those gaps.
I agree. I'm excited.
Yeah, me too. Well, I think we're about out of time. Thank you, everyone who watched and who will watch in the future. And thank you so much to Dana for doing this with me. It was really fun.
Thank you, Professor.